Have you ever been so cold that your body stops shivering because it doesn't have the energy left to generate heat? So cold that your fingers freeze to your rifle and skin tears away when you try to let go? So cold that men fall asleep in their foxholes and never wake up, not from bullets or shrapnel, but from the temperature itself becoming a weapon as deadly as any German gun? Can you imagine fighting a battle where the weather kills as many men as the enemy does, where frostbite takes more casualties than combat, where you have to choose between keeping your feet or keeping your fighting position? What happens to a man's soul when he's pushed beyond every limit he thought he had, when he's colder and more exhausted and more terrified than he ever imagined possible, and he still has to stand and fight because there's nowhere to retreat to and no one coming to save him? I know the answers to these questions because I lived them in December 1944, in a frozen forest in Belgium that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. I know what it means to survive when survival itself seems impossible. I know what it costs, and I'm still paying the price 79 years later. My name is Raymond Mitchell, and I was a staff sergeant in the 99th Infantry Division, a green unit that had only arrived in Europe in November 1944. We'd been positioned in what everyone called the Ghost Front, a quiet sector of the Ardennes forest where nothing ever happened, where we were supposed to get some easy combat experience before being moved to the real fighting. It was a joke assignment, or so we thought. The veterans laughed at us, called us the battle babies because we hadn't seen real combat yet. We were holding a thinly defended line along the German border, spread too thin, without proper winter equipment, thinking we'd just be marking time until spring when the real offensive would begin. We had no idea that Hitler was massing his last reserves for one final, desperate gamble, planning to punch through our lines and drive to Antwerp, splitting the Allied forces and hoping to force a negotiated peace. We had no idea that on December 16, 1944, all hell was going to break loose, and our quiet sector would become the focal point of the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in Europe. December started cold, colder than any of us Midwestern boys were prepared for. We were issued wool uniforms and one blanket per man, and that was supposed to be enough. It wasn't. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there, and we huddled in our foxholes trying to stay warm, burning anything we could find for fuel, wrapping ourselves in whatever we could scavenge. I commanded a squad of 12 men, most of them 19 or 20 years old. Kids who'd been working in factories or going to college 6 months earlier and now found themselves in frozen holes in the ground, waiting for a war that seemed distant and unreal. We pulled guard duty in shifts, 2 hours on, 4 hours off, and those 2 hours in the cold and darkness felt like an eternity. Your feet went numb first, then your hands, then your face. You'd stomp and move and try to keep the blood flowing, but it never really helped. The cold was relentless, seeping through every layer of clothing, settling into your bones, making you fantasize about warmth the way a starving man fantasizes about food. On December 15th, we had turkey for dinner. The Army had promised us a proper meal, and they delivered hot turkey and gravy and all the fixings, served in our mess tent. It was the best meal we'd had in months, and the men were in good spirits, laughing and joking, grateful for something hot in their stomachs. I remember Private Davidson, a kid from Ohio, saying this was going to be the easiest war deployment anyone ever had, just sitting in the Ardennes eating turkey and waiting for the Germans to surrender. We all laughed. We all believed him. That night I went to sleep in my dugout, wrapped in my blanket and my field jacket, listening to the wind howl through the trees, thinking about home and wondering if we'd be back by Christmas. I had no idea that within 12 hours, everything would change. The barrage started at 5:30 in the morning on December 16th. I was jolted awake by the sound of incoming artillery, a sound I'd only heard in training, never in actual combat. The explosions were deafening, shells screaming out of the darkness and detonating all around our positions. The ground shook like an earthquake. Trees exploded into splinters. Men were screaming. I grabbed my rifle and steel helmet and scrambled out of my dugout into chaos. The entire sky to the east was lit up with muzzle flashes, hundreds of German guns firing in unison, pounding our lines with everything they had. This wasn't harassing fire or a probe. This was a full-scale bombardment, the prelude to an attack. I found my squad, or what I could gather of them in the darkness and confusion. We huddled in our foxholes while the shells fell, praying none would land directly on us, waiting for it to stop. The bombardment went on for 90 minutes, the longest 90 minutes of my life up to that point. When it finally lifted, there was a moment of eerie silence, and then we heard them. Engines, tanks, the distinctive clank and rumble of German armor moving toward our positions, and voices, hundreds of voices, German soldiers advancing through the forest. The attack had begun. We opened fire as soon as we could see targets, shadowy figures moving through the pre-dawn gloom and the fog that hung over everything. My men were scared, some of them firing wildly, but we'd trained for this, and training took over. I moved along the line, steadying them, directing their fire, trying to maintain some semblance of organization. German infantry came at us in waves and we cut them down, but they kept coming. Behind them came the tanks, and that's when I knew we were in serious trouble. We had no anti-tank weapons, nothing that could stop armor. We could hear our officers on the radio, calling for support, for artillery, for reinforcements, but nothing came. We were on our own. By mid-morning, our position was being overrun. Germans were flanking us on both sides, and we received orders to fall back to secondary positions. We grabbed what we could carry and retreated through the forest, leaving our foxholes and dugouts behind, leaving wounded men who couldn't be moved, leaving everything we'd built over the past month. The retreat was chaotic, units getting separated, men getting lost in the forest, German artillery following us, shells bursting in the treetops and showering us with wood splinters and shrapnel. I kept my squad together through sheer force of will, counting heads constantly, making sure no one fell behind. We reached the secondary position, which was nothing more than a hastily dug line of foxholes, and prepared to make another stand. But the Germans kept coming. All through December 16th and 17th, they pushed us back, mile by mile, overwhelming our positions with superior numbers and armor. The 99th Division, along with the 2nd and 106th, were taking the brunt of the attack, and we were being slowly crushed. Command was in chaos. Nobody knew what was happening on the broader front. We just knew we had to keep fighting, keep retreating, keep trying to slow the German advance. And through it all, the cold never let up. Men were collapsing from exhaustion and hypothermia as much as from wounds. We had no hot food, barely any water because our canteens froze solid. We couldn't build fires because they'd give away our positions. We just kept moving, kept fighting, kept freezing. On December 18th, my squad ended up in a small Belgian village called Krinkelt, which had become a major defensive position. The 2nd and 99th Divisions were making a stand there, trying to hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive, trying to plug the hole the Germans had punched in our lines. The fighting in Krinkelt was house to house, brutal and close quarters, unlike anything I'd experienced. We'd clear a building of Germans only to have them counterattack and take it back. The village changed hands multiple times, and the casualties mounted. My squad was down to 8 men by then, 4 lost in the retreat, killed or captured or simply vanished in the chaos. The cold in Krinkelt was even worse than in the forest because the village was exposed to the wind that swept across the open fields. We occupied the 2nd floor of a stone house, firing from the windows at German infantry advancing across the snow-covered streets. The snow had started falling on December 17th and hadn't stopped, accumulating rapidly, making movement difficult, covering the dead who lay in the streets. I watched Private Davidson, the kid who'd joked about the easy war, get shot by a German sniper while trying to cross from one building to another. He fell in the middle of the street calling for help, but we couldn't reach him without getting shot ourselves. I had to order my men to stay down, had to listen to Davidson crying out for almost an hour before he finally went silent. That's what command means in combat, making the choice to sacrifice one man to save the others, and living with that choice forever. We held Crinkelt for 2 days, trading fire with Germans who were just as cold and exhausted as we were. On December 19th, we received orders to fall back again, this time to a place called Elsenborn Ridge. The withdrawal from Krinkelt was conducted under cover of darkness, the entire 2nd and 99th Divisions pulling out of the village and moving west. The march to Elsenborn Ridge was 7 miles through knee-deep snow, in temperatures that had dropped to near zero, carrying all our equipment and weapons. trying to move quietly despite our exhaustion. Men fell out of the column, too tired or too cold to continue. Some were picked up by medics following behind. Others just sat down in the snow and refused to move, and we had to leave them because we couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, had to keep moving or risk being overtaken by the German advance. I lost another man during that march. Private Kowalski, one of my best soldiers, simply collapsed in the snow and wouldn't get up. I tried to get him moving, shook him, yelled at him, even slapped him. But he just stared at me with empty eyes and said he was done. He couldn't walk anymore. He just wanted to sleep. I knew that if he fell asleep in that temperature, he'd die. I grabbed him by his field jacket and tried to drag him, but I was too exhausted myself. And I had 7 other men who needed me to get them to safety. I made the decision to leave him there, flagged down a medic who was following our column, and kept moving. I found out later that Kowalski survived, was evacuated with severe frostbite, lost 8 toes and 3 fingers. He survived because I left him behind. I've never been sure if I made the right choice or if I just abandoned him to save myself from having to carry him. We reached Elsenborn Ridge on December 20th and immediately started digging in. The ridge was a key terrain feature, high ground that overlooked the German advance, and if we could hold it, we could prevent the Germans from exploiting their breakthrough. But digging foxholes in frozen ground was almost impossible. The earth was hard as concrete, and we had to use picks and axes to break through, then scoop out the dirt with entrenching tools, working for hours to create holes barely deep enough to provide cover. My hands were so cold I couldn't feel the pick handle, and when I finally stopped to rest, I saw that my palms were covered in blisters that had broken and frozen, leaving raw flesh exposed. I wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a dead German's uniform and kept working because there was no choice. Dig or die. Those were the options. The German attack on Elsenborn Ridge began on December 21st and continued for 3 days. They threw everything at us, infantry and armor and artillery, trying to break through our lines and continue their advance toward the Meuse River. But we held. The 2nd and 99th Divisions, bloodied and battered and frozen half to death, held that ridge against everything the Germans could throw at us. We fought from our foxholes, firing until our ammunition ran low, then rationing our shots, making every bullet count. We called in artillery strikes on German formations, walked fire in so close we could feel the blast concussions in our holes. We repelled attack after attack, and slowly, impossibly, we stopped them. The German offensive stalled at Elsenborn Ridge. They couldn't break through. They'd punched a bulge into our lines, hence the name, but they couldn't complete the breakthrough, and every day they were delayed was another day for reinforcements to arrive, for the Allies to shift divisions to contain the threat. But the cost was staggering. My squad of 12 men was down to 5 by Christmas Eve. 7 men lost in 8 days, killed or wounded or missing. I knew all their names, knew their families, knew their dreams. Private Davidson from Ohio, who'd wanted to be a teacher. Corporal Jenkins from Alabama, who had a wife and baby daughter he'd never met. Private Martinez from Texas, who could play the guitar and used to sing for us in the evenings. Private First Class O'Brien from Boston, who told the funniest jokes and kept morale up even when things looked hopeless. They were gone, all of them, and I was alive, and I couldn't figure out why. Why had I survived when better men hadn't? What was special about me that deserved survival? I had no answers, just guilt and exhaustion, and a cold so deep it felt like it would never go away. Christmas Eve 1944 was the coldest night of my life. The temperature dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind that made it feel even colder. We were still in our foxholes on Elsenborn Ridge, still on alert for German attacks, still unable to build fires or seek real shelter. I shared a foxhole with Private Henderson, a quiet kid from Montana who barely ever spoke. We huddled together for warmth, wrapped in every piece of cloth we could find, pressed against each other because body heat was all we had. I could hear Henderson's teeth chattering, could feel him shivering uncontrollably, and I knew he was slipping into hypothermia. I talked to him, kept him awake, told him stories about home, about my family, about the farm in Iowa where I'd grown up, about anything to keep him conscious. If he fell asleep, he'd die. So I talked all night, my voice getting hoarse, my own body shivering so hard I could barely get the words out. But I kept talking, and Henderson kept responding. And somehow, We both made it to morning. Christmas Day brought no relief. The Germans launched another attack, and we spent Christmas fighting for our lives, firing our rifles with fingers so numb we could barely feel the triggers, throwing grenades with hands that wouldn't close properly around them. There was no turkey dinner, no Christmas carols, no packages from home. There was just the cold and the fighting and the dying. I remember thinking about my family back in Iowa, imagining them around the tree, opening presents, singing songs, safe and warm. They had no idea what I was going through. Nobody back home did. The newspapers would talk about the Battle of the Bulge, would call it a great American victory, would praise the heroism of the troops, but they'd never capture what it really felt like to be there. To be so cold you wanted to die just to make it stop. To watch your friends freeze to death in their foxholes. To fight when you had nothing left to fight with except stubbornness and the knowledge that surrender meant death anyway. The German offensive finally stalled and then began to collapse after Christmas. They'd overextended themselves, outrun their supply lines, failed to capture the fuel depots they needed to keep their tanks moving. The weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to fly, and our planes hammered the German columns mercilessly. Patton's Third Army broke through from the south and relieved Bastogne. Reinforcements arrived at our sector, fresh divisions that took over our positions and allowed us to finally be pulled off the line. On December 27th, 11 days after the initial attack, what was left of my squad was relieved. We marched off Elsenborn Ridge, barely able to walk, looking more like refugees than soldiers, and were trucked to a rear area for rest and refit. The casualty rates for the Battle of the Bulge were horrific. The 99th Division alone suffered over 70% casualties in the first week of the battle. Of my original squad of 12 men, only 4 survived unwounded, including myself. 3 were dead, 4 were wounded and evacuated, and 1 was missing, never to be found. But the battle had been won. The German offensive had been stopped and then reversed. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and Germany would never again have the resources to launch such an attack. The war would continue for 4 more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. We'd held at Elsenborn Ridge, held at Bastogne, held all along the shoulders of the Bulge, and that holding had broken the back of the German army. The frozen hell we'd endured had mattered. The men who'd died there hadn't died for nothing. That's what I told myself then, and that's what I still tell myself now, though there are days when I'm not sure I believe it. The physical toll of those 11 days was severe. I was treated for frostbite on my hands and feet, losing 2 toes on my left foot and having permanent nerve damage in my fingers that makes them ache whenever the temperature drops. I lost 30 pounds during the battle, my body consuming itself to generate heat and energy. I had nightmares for months afterward. Would wake up in the middle of the night thinking I was still in that foxhole, still freezing, still waiting for the next German attack. But the psychological toll was worse. I'd lost 7 men from my squad, and I felt responsible for every one of them. I second-guessed every decision I'd made, wondered if I could have done something differently, saved someone who died. I carried the weight of command, the burden of being the one who survived when so many others didn't. I stayed with the 99th Division through the end of the war, fighting through the Siegfried Line and into Germany itself. We were there when Germany surrendered in May 1945, were part of the occupation force afterward. But nothing compared to those 11 days in December. The rest of the war seemed almost easy by comparison. We had better equipment, better supplies, warmer weather. We knew we were winning. The desperation and terror of the Bulge, the absolute uncertainty of whether we'd survive another hour, that was unique. That was hell. Frozen hell. And everyone who was there carries the scars, visible and invisible. I came home in late 1945, was discharged at Fort Sheridan in Illinois, and took a train back to Iowa. My family met me at the station, and they hardly recognized me. I'd left home as a healthy 22-year-old farm boy, weighing 180, full of energy and optimism. I came back weighing 140, with frostbite scars and a limp, and eyes that had seen too much. My mother cried when she hugged me, and I couldn't figure out why until I saw myself in a mirror later. I looked old, used up, hollowed out. The war had aged me in ways that had nothing to do with time. I was 23 years old, but I looked and felt 40. Readjusting to civilian life was harder than I expected. Everything seemed strange and trivial. People complained about rationing and shortages, and I wanted to tell them they had no idea what real hardship was. They talked about the cold Iowa winter, and I wanted to laugh because this cold was nothing, was comfortable compared to what I'd endured. I couldn't relate to people who hadn't been there, couldn't explain what I'd experienced in ways they'd understand. So I stopped trying. I got a job working on the family farm, married a local girl named Dorothy who I'd known since grade school, started building a life. But part of me was still in that foxhole in Belgium, still freezing, still fighting, still trying to keep my men alive. The nightmares persisted for years. I'd wake up screaming, thrashing, Dorothy holding me and trying to calm me down while I slowly remembered where I was, that the war was over, that I was safe. The sound of wind would transport me back to the Ardennes, and I'd find myself tensing up, waiting for artillery. Cold weather was the worst. Every winter, when the temperature dropped, my hands and feet would ache from the old frostbite injuries, and I'd remember those days and nights when the cold was a physical presence, an enemy as dangerous as the Germans. I'd remember Henderson in the foxhole on Christmas Eve, remember keeping him alive by talking all night, remember the sound of his teeth chattering and the feel of his body shivering against mine. I'd remember Davidson dying in the street, remember his voice calling for help, remember having to order my men to leave him there. The memories never faded. They just became something I learned to live with, like the limp and the aching fingers, permanent injuries that would never fully heal. I eventually connected with some of the other survivors from my squad, the men who'd made it through with me. We wrote letters, visited each other occasionally, gathered for reunions every few years. Being with them helped, because they understood in ways no one else could. We didn't have to explain or justify. We'd shared the experience, survived the same hell, carried the same scars. Private Henderson, the kid I'd kept alive in the foxhole on Christmas Eve, became one of my closest friends. He'd moved to Oregon after the war, worked as a logger, raised a family. We talked on the phone every Christmas Eve, a tradition we maintained for over 60 years until he passed away in 2010. During those calls, we'd remember that night, remember how close we'd come to dying, remember the men who hadn't made it. It was our way of honoring them, of keeping their memory alive. I'm 99 years old now, one of the last surviving veterans of the Battle of the Bulge. Most of the men who fought there are gone, taken by time if not by war. The last time I attended a 99th Division reunion, there were only 12 of us left, old men in our 90s, bodies failing, but memories still sharp. We talked about the Ardennes, about Elsenborn Ridge, about the cold and the fear and the friends we'd lost. We cried, those of us who still could, mourning men who'd been dead for 75 years, but were still alive in our memories. And we made a pact that day that those of us who were left would keep telling the story, would keep the memory alive for as long as we could, so that the sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. That's why I'm telling this story now, while I still can. Because the Battle of the Bulge wasn't just about tactics and strategy and the failure of Hitler's last offensive. It was about young men, boys really, who were thrust into conditions beyond human endurance and somehow found the strength to endure anyway. It was about standing in frozen foxholes when every instinct screamed to run. About fighting when you were so cold and tired you could barely hold your rifle. About watching your friends die and knowing you had to keep going because there was no one else to hold the line. It was about ordinary Americans, farm boys and factory workers and college kids, doing extraordinary things because the alternative was unthinkable. We weren't heroes. We were just scared young men trying to survive, trying to do our duty, trying not to let our friends down. But we held that ridge. We stopped the German advance. We won that battle, though the cost was almost more than we could bear. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I think about December 1944. I think about my squad, about the 7 men who didn't come home. I think about the cold, about how it seeped into everything, became a presence we lived with constantly. I think about Christmas Eve in that foxhole, about keeping Henderson alive through the long frozen night. I think about the choices I made, the orders I gave, the men I couldn't save, and I remember why it mattered, why we fought so hard, why we endured the frozen hell of the Bulge. We fought for each other, for the men beside us in the foxholes. We fought for our families back home, for the country we loved, for the belief that freedom was worth the cost. We fought because someone had to, and we were the ones who were there. That's the simple truth of it. We were there, and we did what needed to be done, and many of us died doing it, and those of us who survived have carried that weight every day since. It's a heavy burden, but it's one I've borne willingly because the alternative would be to forget them, to let their sacrifice fade into history, and I won't do that. Not while I'm still alive to remember, to bear witness, to tell their story. The frozen hell of the Bulge tested us in ways nothing else ever could. It stripped away everything except what was essential, left us raw and exposed, showed us what we were really made of. Some men broke, most held. A few even found something like nobility in the suffering, discovered reserves of courage and endurance they never knew they possessed. I don't know which category I fell into. I just know I survived, that I kept my men together as best I could, that I made decisions I still question but wouldn't change. I know that those 11 days in December 1944 defined the rest of my life, that everything that came after was measured against that experience, that nothing else would ever seem quite as difficult or quite as important. The cold eventually ended. Spring came to Belgium, melting the snow, revealing the full extent of the carnage. But for those of us who were there, winter never really left. We carry it with us still, a permanent chill in our souls, a reminder of what we endured and what we lost. That's the real legacy of the Bulge, not the strategic victory or the military accolades, but the knowledge that we stood in the frozen hell and didn't break, that we paid a terrible price but held the line, that we did our duty when duty demanded everything we had to give. That's what I want people to remember. That's what matters. If this story touched you, if it helped you understand what our greatest generation endured during World War II, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from the veterans who lived through it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. These memories are precious and soon all of us will be gone. Help us keep these stories alive. Help us honor the men who didn't come home from the frozen Ardennes, who died in foxholes and on snowy roads and in Belgian villages, who gave everything so that we could live in freedom. They deserve to be remembered. Thank you for listening to an old soldier's memories. Thank you for caring enough to remember.